Masechet Zevaḥim Daf Yod Gimel. HaPesach v'achatat sheshechatan shelo lishman. Kibel v'halach v'zarak shelo lishman. O lishman v'shelo lishman. O shelo lishman v'lishman pesulim. So following up on the first Mishnah, we emphasize here that the Korban Pesach and Korban Hatat, if one did Shechita for the sake of a different type of Korban, then not only will it not fulfill the obligation for the owner, which is true for any Korban, but furthermore, that korban itself is pasul, cannot continue to be offered. So far we know about shechita, but not only shechita, any of the four avodot, if one received the blood, or walked it to the mizbeach, or threw it, sprinkled it on the mizbeach, having in mind for a different korban, all those things are pesulin. Furthermore, we add, let's say you combined. You started off doing the shechita for the sake of the proper thing. Let's say it's a Korban Pesach, and you have in mind Pesach. But then, in the middle, you change to think of a different thing, or Olah. Or you started off thinking about a Korban Olah, and then you fixed it, and you thought of a Korban Pesach. Nevertheless, because part of it was not lishma, the whole thing is pasul. Kesad lishman v'shelo lishman. Let's give an example of what it means that if it's for proper intent and also not for proper intent, l'shem Pesach, l'shem shelamim. It's a Korban Pesach. You started with Pesach, but then you went and said and thought it was a shelamim. Shelo lishman v'lishman, l'shem shelamim, l'shem Pesach. Or the other way around. At first, it's shelo lishma and then lishma. It is designated as a Korban Pesach. At first, you thought it's a shelamim, and then you corrected it and said it's Korban Pesach. Either way, no good. Shehazevach nifsal ba'arba'a debarim. Bishchita, bekibul, behiluch, ubezerika. Because a korban will become pasul with the four avodot. These are the major four avodot. Shechita, the slaughtering, the receiving the blood, the bringing the blood to the mizbeach, and sprinkling the blood. In a way, this probably should have been the first Mishnah because it gives all these basic things that we had to know already. But that's not the way of the Mishnah to go in conceptual order. But sometimes you have to fill in. That's why it's oral Torah, so that the teacher would fill in these things, and then you get to the principles as they come up. Rabbi Shimon machshir behiluch shehaya omer, I efshar shelo b'shchita v'shelo b'kabbalah v'shelo b'zrika v'al efshar v'lo hiluch shochet besad hamizbeach ve'zorek. Here's probably why the basic principle is not said in the first Mishnah, because there's a lot of discussion around it. So the first Mishnah gives a basic outline, but then these four avodot, we have to see that there's a machloket about them. So Rabbi Shimon says, regarding hiluch, if you're carrying the blood of a Korban Pesach, and have in mind while you're carrying it that it's for a Korban Shelamim, then that's okay, it's still kosher. Why? Because the other three are indispensable. It's impossible to make a korban if you don't do shechita, and if you don't receive the blood, and if you don't throw the blood on the altar. Those are indispensable. But it is possible to make a korban without walking it. For example, if you do shechita, like let's say for a shelamim, it couldn't be with one that has to be on the northern side, but a shelamim doesn't have to be on the northern side. You could do shechita right next to the mizbeach, and then you can throw it right there. You have to slaughter it, you have to receive it, and then you can throw it right onto the mizbeach. So, since holacha is something that is dispensable, it's you can do without it. Therefore, it's not going to ruin the whole korban if you had the wrong intention. We understand that logic. Could it be Eliezer omer hamalech makom shu sarich lehalech machshava poselet makom she'eno sarich lehalech and machshava poselet. Rabbi Eliezer is an in-between opinion, and he says if you are walking the blood in a situation where you need to walk it, you slaughtered it far away from the mizbeach, so now you have to walk it. In that case, while you're walking it, because it's necessary to walk it there, if you think the wrong thought, of a different korban, it will be pasul. However, if you slaughtered it right next to the mizbeach, so you're in a situation where the walking is not necessary, then he would agree in that case with Rabbi Shimon that having a wrong thought will not make it pasul. Gemara asks, "V'kabbalah mi pasla?" Is this true that if one has improper intention while receiving the blood, that would make the korban no good? V'hatanya, we have a baraita that seems to say the opposite, that kabbalah is not so important, not as much as shechita, and we're going to see at the end of this baraita that kabbalah is different. And in fact, if you have while doing Kabbalah, have in mind that it's a Shelamim, not a Pesach, that it's okay. We're going to see it from the continuation of the Braita. The beginning of the Braita actually supports the Mishnah and says, "V'ikribu zo Kabbalat Adam." Ata omer Kabbalat Adam o eno ela zerika. Kesho omer v'zariku hare zerika amur. Ha ma ani mekayem v'ikribu zo Kabbalat Adam. Bnei Aaron HaKohanim sheteh bechohen kasher u'bichle sharet. Let's look at the pasuk inside, so we can see what we're talking about here. V'shachat et ben habakar lifnei Adonai, v'ikribu bnei Aaron hakohanim et adam, v'zarku et adam al mizbeach sabib asher petach ohel moed. So we take this first. We have v'ikribu. That's the main pasuk, the main word that we're going to analyze, and it also says bnei Aaron hakohanim. So only the bnei Aaron hakohanim can do this. V'ikribu, and then later on it says v'zariku, that they sprinkle the blood. So let's see what we need these for. When it says v'ikribu, the thesis is that this is referring to receiving the blood. Now, is that true? Is it we're talking about receiving the blood? Maybe v'ikribu means sprinkling it. Literally, v'ikribu means to bring close. So maybe it means bring close to the mizbeach and sprinkle it on. Yeah, but that can't be, because the continuation of the pasuk says v'zariku. You're going to sprinkle the blood onto the mizbeach. So therefore, v'ikribu cannot be v'zariku. So what must it mean? It must be kabbalat adam. Now theoretically, you could also say it's holacha, but we've said elsewhere that kabbalah and holacha they go hand in hand, and so we're going to attribute it to kabbalah because you need to do kabbalah, and then only then you could do holacha. So we say it is kabbalah. Now, from the words bnei Aaron kohanim, we learn that it has to be a kohen who's kasher, not blemished, not a problem. Has to be a kosher kohen, and he has to be wearing the proper garments while he's doing that. This is an essential service, so you need a proper kohen, and he has to be properly clothed. Others say klei sharet means and he has to receive it in a holy vessel. Amar Rabbi Akiva, the Braita continues with, now we're going to see the differing opinion. But first, Rabbi Akiva gives a different source just for the Kohanim part. Rabbi Akiva says, this is not sufficient, the pasuk itself, to teach us there has to be a kosher kohen, and he has to be wearing the priestly garments, because it just says bnei Aaron kohanim, and just from those words might sound like any of the bnei Aaron kohanim, even one that's pasul, even one that's wearing regular clothes. So you don't really know just from that pasuk. But Rabbi Akiva will derive it. Ne'emar kan bnei Aaron, v'ne'emar lehalan ele shemot bnei Aaron hakohanim ha'meshuchim ha'lehalan bechohen kasher b'chlei sharet, ha'afkan bechohen kasher u'bichlei sharet. It says here the words bnei Aaron, and we will make a gezer hashava to the beginning of Bemidbar, where it says these are the names of the sons of Aaron, Kohanim, who were anointed, that were consecrated to minister as Kohanim. So you see that these are official Kohanim who are kosher, who have been dressed and are ready. So just like over there, it's kosher Kohanim who are wearing the priestly garments. So too has to be here a kosher Kohen with priestly garments. The Baraita continues, Amar Bitafon, Akapeach et banai, im lo shamati labchin hefresh ben kabbalah lezrika, ve'en li defaresh. Bitafon says, I received a tradition, and I will bury my sons if I did not receive a tradition to distinguish between receiving the blood and sprinkling the blood. But I don't know how to explain it. So Bitafon's remembering that his teachers told him that there's a different law when it comes to receiving the blood and sprinkling the blood. But he didn't know what the difference was. But he's 100% sure that there is a difference, and he heard it. He's so sure he's willing to swear on the lives of his sons. That's how seriously he takes this tradition, and he really wants to know what it was. So he's asking around. Amar Rabbi Akiva, Ani afaresh. Rabbi Akiva says, I will explain it to you. Kabbalah lo asa b'machshava k'maaseh, zerika asa b'machshava k'maaseh. Actually, three differences. Number one, regarding receiving the blood, the thought is not the same as the action. Whereas for sprinkling the blood, the thought is the same as the action. In other words, when it comes to zerika, if you have improper thought, it's like having improper action, and it's no good. Zerika, if you have a thought for a different korban, we throw it out. But for Kabbalah, not true. For Kabbalah, as long as you're doing it correctly, even if you have an improper thought, we don't say the improper thought is like an action. And receiving the blood, let's say it's Korban Pesach, and you receive it having in mind the Teshelamim, that's okay, it's kosher. This is our question. It's from right here, because this contradicts the Mishnah that says for all the avodot, including Kabbalah, false and wrong intention will make it pasul. So that's going to be the question. But we have to finish the Braita. Also, if one receives the blood outside of the Bet HaMikdash, it's not allowed, but not chayav karet. But if you sprinkled it on some other temple outside the Bet HaMikdash, then you do get karet. That's the second difference. Third, if a kohen who is pasul receives it, he doesn't get mitabid shamayim. But if a kohen who's pasul sprinkles it, then he does get mitabid shamayim. Amar lo Rabbi Tarfon, avoda at hatitita yamin usmol. Ani shamati ve'en li lefaresh. Ata doresh umaskim la shemua. Balashon hazeh amar lo Akiva. Kol haporesh memecha keporesh mechayav. Rabbi Tarfon says, I swear by the temple service that this is exactly what I heard. I would swear that the temple service should end if you deviated right or left. In other words, you said it exactly. I actually heard the tradition, and yet I was not able to explain it. I forgot the details, and yet you, Rabbi Akiva, is younger than Rabbi Tarfon, you did not hear that tradition, and yet you are deriving it from Pesukim, and your derivation happens to coincide exactly with the tradition. We don't have right here Rabbi Akiva's derivations from the Pesukim, but he wasn't just saying it, he wasn't just making it up, but rather he was deriving it from Pesukim, and so Rabbi Tarfon said, and with this language, Akiva, anyone who separates from you is separating from his life. You are the source of life. And this shows Rabbi Akiva's acumen, that he can derive from Pesukim so accurately that it ends up agreeing with the tradition. He didn't even hear the tradition. And so Rabbi Akiva is able to actually reconstruct the oral law in case it was forgotten. He has the methodology down set that he can actually reconstruct a tradition. Amazing. That's the end of the Baraita. So now our question. The Mishnah said that if one does Kabbalah shelo lishma, it's pasul. But Rabbi Tarfon, Rabbi Akiva here have a tradition and a derivation that if one does, that Kabbalah is not the same as Zerika. If you do Kabbalah shelo lishma, it's still kosher. So how can we explain this? Amar Rabba la kashya kan b'machshevet pigul kan b'machshevet shelo lishma. Rabba says no, it's no question. This baraita, when it says wrong intention, it was wrong intention of pigul, whereas the Mishnah was the wrong intention for shelo lishma. The Mishnah, as it says, is when you have the wrong type of offering in mind. It's supposed to be a Korban Pesach. You have in mind that's going to be the Korban Shelamim. That's what we're talking about there. That's where it makes it pasul even for Kabbalah. However, pigul means if during one of the 4 avodot, one has in mind, well, we'll see if it applies to all 4 avodot. But generally, if you have in mind during the avodot that this korban will be consumed after its time. For example, a korban shelamim can be consumed by the owners, by anybody, for a day, a night, and the next day. That's permitted. But by the 3rd day, it cannot be eaten by anybody. That's one type of consumption. Or consumed on the mizbeach. Has to be consumed on that proper day. On the mizbeach, not the next day, not the day after that. If one, let's say, does shechita or zirika, having in mind that I'm doing zirika and I will consume this shalamim in 3 days from now. That's called pigul. It's no good at all. Very serious prohibition. However, this baraita, when Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva were talking, That's talking about pigul. If I do Kabbalah, I receive the blood, I'm receiving the blood, having in mind that I'm going to eat it in 3 days from now. It's kosher, that's what they're talking about. So, pigul is more lenient in this regard than machshaveh shelo lishma, when at least when it comes to receiving the blood shelo lishma, that's the Mishnah, no good. Receiving the blood for pigul, that's okay. And the Mishnah, if you look carefully at the words, seems to say that, in fact, exactly that, because the Mishnah says that the korban will be disqualified. It doesn't say mitpagel, that it becomes pigul, which would be a special word if it was talking about pigul. Pigul, one gets karet for that. So you have to say a special word if you meant that. It doesn't say that. It says she'azevach nifsal. So it sounds like the Mishnah is not talking about pigul. The Baraita is talking about pigul. Okay, Rava answered the question. The problem is that that's going to prompt the next question. Umachshevet pigul lo pasla beKabbalah. Is that true that a thought of pigul, to eat it after its time, does not disqualify for Kabbalah? Look at the following Baraita that says that pigul is going to apply to everything. All the avodot. V'hatanya yachol lo tehe machshaba mo'elet ela bizrika bilbad meinayin l'rabot shechita v'kabbalah Talmud lomar ve'im he'achol ye'achel mibesar zebach shel hamav pigul hu bayom hashlishi lo yeraseh. Can it be that a wrong thought of pigul will be a problem only for zerika? How do I know that also? If I have a pigul thought during shechita and during Kabbalah, also it will become pigul, because the main pasuk, this is in the context of a korban shelamim, and says, if someone eats from the flesh of this zevach shelamav, or korban shelamim, it will become a pigul if he eats it on the third day. If we look at the pasuk inside, we see that these words in parentheses are actually in the wrong place. So the full pasuk is v'im he'achol ya'achel mibesar zevach shelamav bayom hashlishi lo yeraseh. If someone should eat from the flesh of a korban shelamim on the third day, korban shelamim can only be in one day, that night, and the second day, only for 2 days. If someone eats it from the third day, then it will not be accepted. Hamakriboto lo yachashev lo. It will not count for him. It's called pigul. And anyone who eats that, avonatisa. So this is very serious. Now, a simple reading of the pasuk sounds like it's talking about someone who actually eats from the korban. However, the midrash was coming up in a few dapim will explain that it's not talking about actually eating the korban on the third day, but rather thinking about planning to eat the korban on the third day while one is doing one of the services. Now, the services are described as v'im he'achol ye'achel. And so the midrash learns from this. The pasuk is talking about thinking of eating it on the third day while doing an action that will lead to consumption. Now, what actions lead to consumption? Certainly the slaughter of the animal, yes, but also the receiving the blood and the sprinkling of the blood. You need to do all these things in order for it to be edible. The korban, the shelamim, is kodesh, and no one can eat it until you do all these things and sprinkle the blood. Then you can eat from the flesh. So therefore, according to this, Kabbalah is included in the prohibition of pigul. The Baraita continues, Yachol shani merabe af shefichat shirayim v'haktarat emurim. Now, should I include also the pouring of the remainder of the blood? When you take the blood of a korban, you sprinkle just a little bit on the mizbeach. The rest of it you pour into a drain on the mizbeach. And every korban has at least some portions that are burnt on the mizbeach. Now, these are things that you do after the sprinkling of the blood. What if, while I'm pouring the extra or putting the sacrificial portions on the mizbeach, I have in mind a pigul thought that I'm going to eat the rest of the flesh on the third day? How about that? Does that make it pigul? The answer is no. Talmud lomar bayom hashlishi lo yeraseh makriboto אותו לא יחשב. זריקה בכלל הייתה, ולמה היא עשתה? להקיש אליה, לומר לך, מה זריקה מיוחדת שהיא עבודה ומעכבת כפרה, אף כל עבודה מעכבת כפרה, יעשו שפיכת שיריים והקטרת אמורים שהן מעכבים את הכפרה. That's why the pasuk says, if someone is planning to eat it on the third day, it will not be accepted. Now the word yedatzeh, when does something become accepted? What does the korban fulfill the obligation and is accepted and atones for the owner? At the point of zirikah. So zirikah was included in imachol yachel. That's already part of the process of things that you have to do to make it edible. So why do I have to specify zirika in the words lo yadaseh if I would already know it from anything, the whole process? It's one of the things in the process is to make a hekesh. So to say, just like zirika is special in that it's one of the major avodot, and you have to do it or else there's no atonement. So too, any avodah that you have to do in order to receive kapara, and that's going to include also shechita and certainly kabbalah and zedika also. So it includes the major avodot, but it will not include the pouring of the extra libation of the extra blood, nor will it include the burning of the innards that are supposed to be on the mizbeach, because those you're supposed to do that, but if you didn't, it's not going to prevent the atonement of the korban. So what we see here is that if one has intention for pigul during the receiving of the blood, it also makes it pigul. And Rava said not so, because Rava said that the baraita is talking about pigul, and the baraita says that if you receive the blood thinking pigul, then it's kosher. But clearly, this baraita says that pigul thoughts also during the receiving of the blood make it pasul. אלא לקשיא הדמר הריני שוחט על מנת לקבל דמה למחר, הדמר הריני מקבל דמה על מנת לשפוך שיריים למחר. So we resolve the problem by explaining that the first baraita, the one about Rabbi Tarfon, which said that pigul, when it comes to Kabbalah, is okay. That's when, at the time of shechita, he's actually doing shechita, and what he has in mind is that he's going to receive the blood tomorrow. Tomorrow's the wrong day. You have to receive the blood on the same day as shechita. So, although that's a problem, it does not become pigul, because pigul only applies to having in mind that one will consume the blood on the wrong day. But Kabbalah is not consuming the blood, that's just receiving the blood, and therefore that's not pigul. That's what Rabbi Tarfon's baraita was talking about. Whereas the baraita that we just cited now, we're explaining the pasuk from Vayikra 7:18, that's talking about a case where one is receiving the blood into the vessel, and he receives it thinking that he is going to pour the leftover wine on the next day. Well, that's a problem, because then he's doing this now, but pouring the wine on the altar, that's the type of consumption. Consumption can mean by the person eating it, if it's permitted to eat the flesh, or the mizbeach consuming it, and so there you go. Amar le'ahu merabbanan l'rava ushfichat shirayim v'haktarat emurin la pasla behu b'machshava. Now this question against Rava is going back to this baraita that said that pigul only relates to the four main avodot, but we exclude pouring the extra blood and the putting the pieces on the mizbeach. And so those are excluded from pigul. But is that true? That pouring the blood and burning the pieces on the mizbeach do not make something pasul when regarding wrong intention for pigul? Vehatenan. But we have a baraita that says, Yachol lo tehe machshava mo'elet ela ba'achilat basar minayin rabot shefichat shirayim v'aktarat emurim. Can it be that a wrong thought will become pigul only regarding eating the flesh? a person eating it? How do you know that also if a person has in mind, let's say during shechita, that he's going to pour the extra or burn the parts on the mizbeach at the wrong time, that also is pigul, meaning not only consumption of the person but also consumption of the mizbeach. Talmud lomar v'im he'achol ye'achel b'shte achilot hakatu medaber achat achilat adam v'achat achilat mizbeach. Has a double verb to say there's two consumptions. One of them is for the consuming of a person, that if it's a hatat, it can be eaten that day, but not the next day, or shilamim could be that day and the next day, but not the third day. So that, I know, that's one type of consumption, and the other type is the consumption on the mizbeach. So we seem to have a contradiction between this baraita here that excludes the haktarat emurim and the shiraim, and this one here that includes it. And we explained la kashya hadamar hareni zorek al menat lishpoch shiraim lemachar, hadamar hareni shofech shiraim al menat laktir emurim lemachar. So there's no problem. The one that says it is pigul, that's when one does zirika, you're throwing the blood and thinking on condition that I am going to pour the extra blood on the next day. So that's the problem, because you're doing a zirika now, and you're having in mind consumption of the mizbeach on the wrong day. So that's the combination that's prohibited. When you're doing one of the four avodot, having in mind consumption of a person or consumption by the mizbeach at the wrong time. That's the case where it's pigul. But the case where before, where we said is permitted, and in fact that was the context, is when one is pouring the extra blood on the mizbeach and having in mind at that point that he's going to put the pieces on the mizbeach on the wrong day. That is not pigul, because here the action that he's doing is shofech shiraim, which is not one of the necessary avodot to make it a valid korban, to make it so that it gives atonement. So that baraita was saying that one can violate pigul only when one is doing one of the major four avodot, having in mind the consumption, but not while doing these two, pouring of the wine or putting the parts on the mizbeach. And so now that we have this answer, it's very clear. Pigul applies to a case where one is doing one of the four avodot, but having in mind either that the people will eat it at the wrong time, or that the mizbeach will consume it at the wrong time. Amar Rabbi Yehuda bered Rabbi Chaya, Shamati she'tebilat espa mefagelet bechatat penimit. Rabbi Yehuda, the son of Rabbi Chaya, reports that he heard a tradition that the dipping of a finger will cause pigul if done with improper intention regarding time when it comes to a chatat that is sprinkled on the inside. So let's explain all these terms. Some types of chatat are sprinkled in the kodesh, on the curtain that separates the kodesh and the kodesh kodashim. So they are sprinkled inside. When they are sprinkled inside, one does not just take the basin and pour it out, but rather you have to dip your finger in, the kohen dips his finger in, and then sprinkles it onto the curtain. That is true for this type of chatat penimit. It is not true for a shilamim. A shilamim that's offered on the outside mizbeach, the blood is thrown from the vessel itself. So there is no tevilat etzba when it comes to a korban shilamim. Now, we just discussed and said that regarding the basic avodot that are done with a korban, if one does them having in mind that it will be consumed at the wrong time, that's pigul. The question here is, what about tevilah, the dipping of a finger? Dipping of a finger is not done for all korbanot. It is done for this kind of hatat. So are you going to call that an essential avodah? And therefore, that will also be included into the category of something that makes it pigul or not? Shema'ah Ilfa Amara Kamed Rav Pada. Ilfa heard this tradition that yes, in fact, the tevilat espa is essential and makes it pigul, and he said it in front of Rav Pada. Amar. Kelum lamadnu pigul ela mishelamim, ma shelamim en tevilat espa mefagelet bahem, afchatat en tevilat espa mefagelet bahem. And Rav Ada challenged this tradition and said, where do we learn pigul from in the first place? From shelamim. That's the pasuk that we discussed in that braita above, from Vayikra 7:18. And regarding shelamim, there is no dipping of the finger, because you don't do it at all. So therefore, you don't have to do it at all. Therefore, if you would do it, there's no pigul. So since that's the source of the law of pigul, and regarding shelamim, if you dip your finger having in mind the wrong time, it's okay. So to chatat, it should be that if you dip your finger in it, it will not be pigul. And so he's challenging this tradition. And we now answer back. Now we're going to introduce another law that if you would learn it directly from shelamim, you would get to the wrong conclusion regarding chatat. So it's not like you can learn everything exactly from shelamim. And this example is, if regarding shelamim, if you do the shechita or something for a shelamim, having in mind a different korban, in that case, it's not pasul, because it's shelamim. Shelamim, if you do it shelo lishma, it's still kosher. And therefore, it will not remove it from the realm of pigul. Here's a law regarding pigul. Something can only be pigul if, except for the pigul wrong intention, it's otherwise a valid korban. Then, if you have the wrong time in mind, then it'll be pigul. But if a korban would be pasul anyway for a different reason, then even though you had in mind a second bad thing, that it's wrong time, then it's not called pigul. Therefore, let's say a korban shelamim, let's use this example here of a korban chatat. A korban chatat that is given shelo lishma, that makes it pasul. So the halacha actually is that a korban chatat that you slaughtered shelo lishma, even if you also had in mind that it's going to be consumed the next day, it's not pigul. That's the halacha. That should be the halacha regarding chatat. But according to your methodology, that you're going to only say something is pigul if it's true for shelamim, then you're going to come to a wrong conclusion that regarding shelamim, if you do it shelo lishma, it does not take it out of the realm of pigul because it's still kosher. So it's still within the realm of pigul. Are you going to say the same thing is for a chatat? If you do slaughter a chatat shelo lishma, that it will not take it out of the realm of pigul and it will be pigul? But that's wrong. Ela ma'it so what do you have to say to answer this? You have to say that not everything that we learn about pigul comes from the pasuk regarding shelamim, but there's other ribuyim, other extra words and letters that we're going to learn it from. You can look in the midrash there that learns other things. And so too here, when it comes to this situation, also the dipping of the finger, you're right. Regarding shelamim, you could the dipping of the finger is not going to make it pigul. But we don't learn everything from korban shelamim. We learn some other laws of pigul from other places, and therefore it's still prohibited, and the tradition is a correct tradition. We're going to have a similar discussion. Amar Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, Ba'aliyah zo shamati shetibilat etzba mefagelet. Another rabbi who had also heard a similar tradition, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, he said on this second story, a lot of times the rabbis would meet in the second story of a person's house. That was the meeting place was on the second story. And I heard a tradition there. He's saying the place to show that, look, I remember exactly where I heard this. It's a true tradition. It's a true story that I'm telling you. That if one has the intention for the wrong time while doing the dipping of the finger for a korban, a chatat that's sprinkled on the inside, that it will make it pigul. Same tradition. Tahiba Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. However, Resh Lakish challenges it. Kilum lamdu pigul ela mishelamim, mashelamim en tevilat espa mefagelet bahen, avchatat en tevilat espa mefagelet bahen. So this tradition doesn't make sense. We only learned the laws of pigul from shelamim. And regarding korban shelamim, if you dip your finger having in mind something else, it's okay, because you don't need to dip a finger for shelamim. So too, Korban Chatat should be the same law because we only derived it from Shelamim, and it should be permitted and not Pigul, and that goes against the tradition. We answer, V'chi Akum Shelamim Lamdu. What, do you think we learn every law of Pigul from Shelamim? Ima Shelamim Shelo Lishman En Mosi mideh pigul, hafchatat shelo lishma en mosi mideh pigul. Because according to that logic, you'd say, just like regarding shelamim, if you did it shelo lishma, it does not take it out of the realm of pigul, meaning it could still be pigul. So too, would you say regarding korban hatat, if you do shechita shelo lishma, it will not take it out of the realm of pigul, and if you have the wrong time in mind, it'll also be pigul? But that's obviously wrong. So obviously, this is not the only source for the laws of pigul. Okay, so that's a similar discussion as the previous one. It just doesn't have the last answer that we learned it from Riboy, but it's similar back and forth. אמר רבי יוסף ברבי חנינא אין, הכל משלמים למדו, הואיל וחוץ למקומו פוסל בשלמים, ושלא לשמו פוסל בחטאת. מה חוץ למקומו הפוסל בשלמים מוציא מידי פיגול, אף שלא לשמו הפוסל בחטאת מוציאה מידי פיגול. Now Rabbi Yosef, son of Rabbi Chanina, is going to challenge that tradition, and he's not going to accept this answer that we said that, we learned the laws of pigul from other cases, from other sources. No. In fact, he's going to explain that we learn all the laws of pigul from shelamim. And nevertheless, as he's about to explain, we can learn the laws of hatat shelo lishmo properly from shelamim, and therefore we can still say we learn all the laws of pigul from shelamim, and you know what's missing is the dipping of the finger. We have no source for that. So in fact, I have a challenge against the tradition. Now, how's it going to learn the laws of shelo lishmo from shelamim, where shelo lishma doesn't apply? He has a brilliant answer. Well, look at chutz limkomo, regarding any korban, including shelamim. If one does shechita, having in mind I'm going to eat it outside the proper place. Shelamim has to be in Yerushalayim, within the walls. If you have in mind, I'm going to eat it outside of Yerushalayim, it's pasul also regarding shelamim. And if I have in mind shelo lishma, when I do shechita for a korban hatat, then that will also make korban hatat pasul. So I can compare them. Although I'm comparing slightly different cases, they are analogous cases. As follows. Just like if I do slaughter a korban shelamim, having in mind chutz limkomo, it's pasul. And since it's pasul, it will remove it from the category of pigul. It cannot possibly become pigul, even if I also have in mind outside the time. So too, if I do shechita on a korban hatat, shelo lishmo, in the name of a different type of korban, and that makes that pasul. So it will also remove it from the law of pigul. So you see, I can learn this korban hatat shelo lishmo properly from shelamim, and because I have an analogous case, but I don't have an analogous case to dipping the finger. Therefore, I cannot learn dipping the finger from shelamim, even though I can learn everything else from shelamim. And therefore, you see, there's no source for this tradition. The tradition is problematic. אמר רבי ירמיה, מסידה תברא, מה לחוץ למקומו הפוסל בשלמים שכן נוהג בכל הזבחים? תאמר בשלו לשמו, שאינו נוהג אלא בפסח וחטאת בלבד. Rabbi Yirmiyah says, no, we can break this analogy from itself. It's inherently disjointed, because the chutz limkomo, the wrong intention for the place, that is true. It makes it pasul for shelamim, but that's true for all korbanot. All korbanot are pasul if you have in mind the wrong place. That will be consumed in the wrong place. Either you're going to eat it or the altar in the wrong place. No good. But you cannot compare that to shelo lishmo, because that applies only to korban pesach and korban chatat. So therefore, these two laws are not analogous, and you cannot learn the law of korban chatat shelo lishmo that removes from pigul from shelamim. Ela ma'it lach lememar davar aposel bahen mosiah midei pigul davar me'akeh bahen mevi'an lidei pigul. Rather, we have an answer. We can derive all the laws of pigul from korban shelamim, and still we can uphold the tradition regarding dipping of the finger. How do we do that? Well, we're going to learn these two basic principles from korban shelamim. Any act that will make a korban pasul will remove it from the category of pigul. So for korban shelamim, doing shechita having in mind the wrong place, well, that will make it pasul. Once it's pasul, it cannot become pigul. And second principle, anything that's a necessary avodah, like shechita for a shelamim, while doing shechita, or anything that's me'akev, anything that's indispensable act, you have in mind the wrong time, then that will be pigul. So that's how it's not pigul, and the second principle is how it will become pigul. That we can generalize to any other korban by analogy. Hachanameh, so too regarding the korban chatat that's sprinkled on the inside, davar posel ba mosi mide pigul, davar me'akev ba mebi'a lide pigul. Something that will make a korban chatat pasul, like shelo lishmo, that will make it pasul. Once you have that in mind, then it cannot become pigul, even if you have in mind that it will be consumed at the wrong time. It's not going to be pigul because there's something else that already made it pasul. Whatever makes that type of korban pasul. It doesn't have to apply to shelamim. It's whatever type of korban you're talking about. And something that is a necessary avodah, in this case, dipping of the finger, well, if you do that, having in mind that it will be consumed at the wrong time, then that will make it pigul. And so there you go. We can learn everything from shelamim. We don't have to rely on any other source, and we can uphold that tradition, that dipping of the finger regarding a korban hatat penimit, if one has in mind the wrong time, it will in fact make it pigul. We end the daf with one final proof in support of this tradition regarding dipping one's finger. Amar Rav Mari, af anan na metanena. We have a source to bring support to this tradition that dipping a finger is essential, and therefore, if one has the wrong intention, it can become pigul, the korban chatat penimit. And we learn it from a Mishnah in Masechet Menachot that reads, Zeh hakilal, kol hakomes v'noten b'kli v'hamolich v'hamaktir. One can violate pigul if one has wrong intention of time regarding a meal offering if one does kemitzah. Kemitzah is the taking of the flour from the big bowl. You take this much, a fistful of flour, and you place it in a vessel. That's a second action. Or bringing it, walking it to the mizbeach, a third action, and putting it on the mizbeach. If one has improper intention regarding time, I will consume it at the wrong time while doing any of these four actions, then it becomes pigul. Now let's analyze. Bishlama kometz hainu shochet. Kometz is the equivalent of shochet. Taking a handful of the flour for a meal offering is the equivalent of doing shechita for an animal. That's the first thing that you're doing. And molich hainu molich, carrying something, the blood, is the same as carrying the flour. Maktir name hainu zorek. Putting the flour on the mizbeach is the same as sprinkling the blood on the mizbeach. Those are equivalent acts. Ela noten bakli mainihu. But what about the placing of the meal offering into the vessel? What is that the same as? Well, it would seem like putting the meal offering into the vessel would be the same as Kabbalah, receiving the blood. So let's try that. But is it in fact the same? No, in that case, the blood squirts out. As soon as you do shechita, the blood squirts out from the animal, and the vessel fills by itself. Whereas here, you have to physically take the flour in your hand and drop it into the bowl. So therefore it seems that these are not similar. Since placing the meal offering into the bowl is not equivalent to receiving the blood, so then we're going to have to wonder, how come this Mishnah says that putting the flour into the bowl is one of the actions that will make it pigul if you have the wrong intention during that time? What would be the source? It doesn't have an equivalent in the korban shelamim, because the korban shelamim has kabbalat adam, but we just said kabbalat adam is different because squirting out by itself is not the same as putting it into a vessel. So what would be the source to say that putting the flour into the vessel would be would make it prohibited as pigul if you had the wrong intention. Ela kevan de la sagid de la yahib al korche avodah chashuba hi hachaname kevan de la sagid de la avid la al korche hainu holacha. Rather, what we have to say is that when it comes to the korban mincha, since it's necessary to put it into the bowl, therefore it's an important service. It's being an important service. If you have in mind the wrong time when you're doing it, it's going to make it pigul. If that's true for a meal offering, even though there's no direct correlation to a korban shalamim, here too, regarding a korban hatata penimit, since dipping the finger is a necessary step, therefore we should treat it the same as holacha. Holacha, you're carrying the bowl from the place where you slaughtered it to the mizbeach, or to the, in this case, to the curtain. But the dipping of the finger is also transporting the blood. You're transporting it from the bowl, and you're going to then use your finger to transport it there. So just like if you have the wrong intention during holacha to consume it at the wrong time, that would make it pigul. So too, the dipping of the finger would also make it a pigul if you have the wrong intention. So we can learn from the korban mincha, since the korban mincha, putting it in the bowl does not have an exact equivalent of a korban shalamim yet, because it's a necessary thing to do. It's included in the pigul category. So too, dipping of the finger will be included and will make it pigul if you have the wrong intention. Isn't that a good proof? We say no. No, in fact, the putting of the meal offering into the vessel is in fact similar to receiving the blood into a vessel. And that which you said, wait, these are different because the blood squirting out by itself, it fills up the bowl by itself passively, whereas for the meal offering, you actually have to physically take the meal offering and put it into the vessel. Well, but so what? Who says that's an important difference? Since both of these are acts by which you get the material, the stuff into the bowl, what is the difference if it comes by itself or if it has to be done more actively? These are equivalent. Since they are equivalent, there's no proof from this Mishnah. The Mishnah gave 4 items, then these four categories of action for a meal offering are exactly one-to-one correlated with the 4 things you have to do for korban shalamim. And therefore you cannot learn from here that any other activity, like dipping of the blood, which has no equivalent, you cannot learn that if one has wrong intention during dipping of the finger, that would also make it pigul. Baruch Adonai le'olam. Amen ve'amen.